If by some miracle Dr. King could come back to Earth 50 years after his brutal assassination, what do you think he'd notice first about the country and the world that he'd left 50 years ago this month? What changes would please him most, and what would cause him the most despair? Elizabeth?
I love that question, and I love the imaginative exercise, because I think that what you're asking with that is someone who we agree on is, the highest example of the values of the betterment of the American people. What is that continuing value as we move forward? I think that he would measure the tremendous progress that we've made in desegregating our society in many ways. I think he would celebrate that there had been an African-American president and that there are African-American and Latino people who are the head of many organizations in a way that was unimaginable before. That would have to be heralded as progress. But he would also point, I think, with despair to two things. One, the enduring challenges not yet solved of race as a defining element in class. And the situation for Black poor people would be something that he would despair because that has not moved enough. I think that what he would also despair about is that racial ideas that govern how it is that people are sometimes reviled for the color of their skin, we have not yet made enough progress on that front. And I think that he would also despair that, especially right now, the language that human beings speak about each other in public is really, unfortunately, in too many instances, quite debased. And that interferes with his hope and dream of beloved community.
Thank you.
A mixed grade.
Okay. Bishop?
Well, Professor, I think he'd give the country a B-. With hope for improvement. And if I were talking with him, I think he would, I would say, my ancestors were slaves in this country. My great-grandparents were sharecroppers. My parents did not receive a lot of higher education. And yet, 10 years ago, at the 40th anniversary of his martyrdom, on April 4, and 40 years after he gave his last sermon at the National Cathedral where I was elected Bishop of Maryland. On the first ballot, we elect our bishops in a diocese that's about 95% white, and where 40 years earlier, I would not have been welcomed as a worshiper in half the parishes in that diocese. That's amazing change in the last 40 years. But he was also a student of human nature, and he knows the complexity of human beings and the complexity of societies that human beings find themselves in. And so he would say, yes, sometimes you take 2 steps forward and a step back. You hope not to take a step forward and 2 steps back. And he would see some steps back in this nation. And I'm happy to talk about some of that a little later.
Okay, thank you. Cecilia?
I think he'd recognize us, right? That for all of the progress that we've made, and it's been considerable, and it's worth celebrating, that a lot of what he was fighting for is stuff that we're still fighting for. And I think he might realize with some despair that the tools that he fought for, particularly the legal tools, the policy tools, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, are not enough, right? They are essential to the progress that we made. But they're not sufficient. And as a policymaker, I really struggle with even just recent data that's come out that shows that even if you can get an African-American family into the middle class, into the upper class economically, it's not clear that a boy growing up in that family will stay there. And in fact, there's a lot of evidence that they don't.
Yeah, you're referring to Raj Chetty's recent study.
Yes, and the disparities that affect, I'm obsessed with this data, the disparities that affect African-American women in maternal outcomes that hold up even when a woman is wealthy, even when she has access to health care, even when that's high quality health care. She's still more likely to lose her baby than a white woman with less than an 8th grade education. There's something going on there that we have not yet figured out the policy tools to address.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a minute. Since that terrible day in 1968, the Black middle class has doubled. The Black upper middle class, just for 2016 inflation, has quadrupled. That's amazing. right? But on the other hand, the percentage of black children living at or beneath the poverty line is about 34%. It was 37% 2010. It's about 41% when Dr. King died. So the black American community has bifurcated. Does that mean the civil rights movement was a failure or the civil rights movement was a success? If the black middle class has doubled, if it's quadrupled, if there are 42 million African Americans, is that a good result or not?
Well, you describe it as if it were a thing that was over, right? The civil rights movement isn't a was, it's an is. And it's both about the legal structures of equality as well as, like, we have an economic struggle. We're getting bifurcated, not just by race, but right, inequality is expanding in this country. And it affects people of color more deeply. But there's multiple layers that we have to deal with, and we have to be dealing with all of them. And Dr. King understood that. He was working on poverty when we lost him. So he understood that race is a piece of this, and economic equity is another.
Are you saying that class trumps race now?
I think we have to be working on all of it.
Bishop?
There is a continuing significance of race. It's very hard for people who do not have to deal with issues of race overtly every day to see it, but it's always there. It's always there. But it is a matrix, and Dr. King saw this in his lifetime. Poverty, violence, racism. The three go together, and I might add environmental degradation as well. I live in Baltimore. A third of Baltimore is booming. The waterfront, all those communities around, condos, businesses coming in. But a third of Baltimore is crumbling. And I walk through some of those streets, and I see the connections between why. It's no accident that when I'm walking these streets where people are murdered every day and crumbling infrastructure everywhere, it's no accident that their faces are black and brown. That is a legacy that he saw himself. And so he would say that there's continuing work to do, but he saw the connections. We think of him primarily as a leader for civil rights and racial movement, but he knew in the year he died, we need to have a poor people's campaign for all poor people.
Do you guys think that we could, in this country, have a popular political movement that was based on class, on economic need? Just a parenthesis, those of you who don't know, I grew up in an Irish-Italian paper mill town about 3 hours from here. It's halfway between Pittsburgh and D.C. And my family's lived there on both my mother's side and my father's side for over 200 years. I'm a Redman on my mother's side and a Redman on my father's side, which perhaps explains some of the aberrant behavior. My fourth great grandfather is a free Negro who fought in the American Revolution. And he mustered in Winchester Christmas Day 1778 and mustered out in April. I grew up with poor, working class, not poor, but working class white people and a handful of black people. So a lot of things that we see as race really, and this is true as soon as you travel, as soon as you leave this country, you realize that a lot of things we see coded as race in this country are really class-based. Bishop, the people that I was alluding to, the people with whom I studied for 12 years in public school, can't stand Barack Obama.
Yes.
West Virginia was the most Democratic state in the Union, except for Massachusetts, until their brother showed up on that ballot, and people said, no, I can't go there. I'm not that Democratic. And West Virginia went heavily for Trump. So how do we create an alliance between poor black people and the poor people that I grew up with?
Well, that was King's vision. When he talked about beloved community, it wasn't just about people of African descent in this nation. He knew that America was a beacon of hope and light for the whole world, and what we do here can make a difference around the world. So his vision of America wasn't just do all of these good things for black people. No. do all of these things to realize the dignity of every human being for all of us, for all of us.
How do we keep people who feel despair and hopelessness from demonizing people of color whom they believe are the reason that they're feeling despair and hopelessness? In other words, and it's a way of returning to this class question, how do you build sympathy, understanding, empathy, and maybe even a politics around shared economic interests, precisely when the rhetoric of the country is creating an othering effect, when there's more racism spoken in vulgar ways publicly now than certainly 10 years ago or even 20 years ago? Elizabeth?
Well, I feel that we counter it with other words. I mean, that is my lane. I think that what people who work in arts and culture can do is, we have the secret sauce because we have the better words. And I think that one thing that's been really, really interesting, if you think about, I'm a poet, and if you think about the portability of poetry, since the election, very interestingly, and this is measurable by hits on the Academy of American Poets website, the Poetry Foundation's website, there has been a vast increase in people seeking poems. Because you can go to those websites and you can search and you say, I want something about hope, I want something about love, I want something for a funeral. So, what I take from that is that words that have meaning, words that are contemplative, words that are concise and can move quickly. And this is where social media is a wonderful, wonderful tool to be able to move these words around. That human beings crave meaning. Human beings crave community. Human beings actually need thoughtfulness. And I think that not just in poetry, but the arts across the board are really the space where we can recognize each other's humanity.
Well, you were in D.C.
Yes.
during the '68 riots that followed
Oh, yes.
Dr. King's assassination. And you work in Baltimore, where Brown Advisory is based, and where a lot of people here today live. What is the impact of race in Baltimore leading up to and since Freddie Gray?
There was an uprising. And that uprising wasn't just because one unarmed black man ended up dead in police custody. That story is told all the time. Here are how the connections are made. I saw a photo of Freddie Gray, who was detained by the policeman. And it showed him as a young child, and he was standing by a bedroom window. And there at the window, you saw flakes of lead paint there. He was poisoned by lead paint. That's environmental degradation. And that sets off a cycle of not doing as well as you can in school. The schools are terrible, and on we go to the cycle of racism, poverty, and violence. I think in the aftermath of King and race in that is that most Americans are people of goodwill. Everyone here are people of goodwill. We want a better society. We want a non-racist society. But the importance is about speaking up and speaking out. Martin Luther King, he said, we begin to die the day we become silent about things that matter.
Can I just build on that? I mean, it's so eloquent and powerful. And I have to say, particularly because of this audience and this gathering on this day, I'm certain that the people in this room are frequently in rooms where there are no people of color. And I know that because I am frequently the only person of color in a lot of rooms that I'm in. And sometimes I'm not the only person of color, but I am the only Latino in the room. And so it's both the question of using inclusive language and building awareness on our parts, but it's also about being in the person in the room that asks the question, why are there no women on that panel? Why are there no people of color in this room? And being the one that kicks open the door, even when it's uncomfortable, and in some ways, especially when it's uncomfortable. So I think it's important to think of policy tools for what they can do, but also recognize, as I think we would say to Dr. King if he were here, the tools that we fought for are not enough. We also have to be going after people's hearts and going after people's prejudices and putting them in the rooms with each other, because it is so much harder to demonize somebody for who they are if they're sitting in front of you and you know them and you know their kids' names and they know yours.
I was asked to choose a poem to conclude for today. And so this is just a small segment because of what we're talking about. This is a long poem that in large part is about the civil rights movement. And that is a movement that I'm very proud my parents, my family were a part of in many, many different ways. My father was on President Johnson's staff and was the liaison who brought Dr. King into the White House, who worked with President Johnson on the Civil Rights
Her
Act.
father promoted Colin Powell.
That is true.
True.
That is true. But so to the sort of civil rights legacy that I'm so proud to speak out of, I think that one of the things I've learned is that, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 1 step forward, 3 steps back, 5 steps forward, but we're always hopefully trying to move towards something. Mm-hmm. And in this poem, I find that embodied in people coming together and marching. So this is called Walking, 1963, and it is a small poem about the Birmingham March. Mm. You tell me knees are important. You kiss your elders' knees in utmost reverence. The knees in the painting are what send the people forward. Once progress felt real and inevitable, as sure as the taste of licorice or lemons. The painting was made after marching in Birmingham, walking into a light both brilliant and unseen.
Beautiful. Ladies and gentlemen, let's thank our panelists. Marvelous.